It all began on a bright Saturday morning in late spring, the kind of day when the neighborhood lawns looked almost too perfect and every driveway gleamed with newly washed SUVs. The subdivision had a reputation for order, hedges trimmed to regulation height, shutters painted in the same range of muted colors, and streets so clean you could almost eat off them. The homeowners association made sure of it, constantly sending out reminders about trash bins, mailbox paint, and which kinds of vehicles were acceptable for display. For years, the association had been clear about one particular rule: no recreational vehicles were to be parked in driveways or visible from the street. They claimed RVs disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic, lowered property values, and set a bad precedent. Residents who owned campers, trailers, or motorhomes either paid for off-site storage or built expensive enclosed garages to hide them. But not me. I had purchased my RV years before I moved into the neighborhood. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was my escape pod. It held memories of long road trips, late-night campfires, and family vacations that meant more to me than any HOA guideline ever could. When I first signed the contract to buy my house, I assumed I would just store the RV at a facility a few miles away, like everyone else. But when the fees kept climbing and availability dropped, I made a decision. I built a custom side gate and poured a reinforced concrete pad along the side of my house, just wide enough to hide the RV behind the privacy fence. Technically, it wasn't visible from the road. Technically, I wasn't breaking the rule, at least. That was my defense. Whenever the HOA president, an overzealous woman everyone secretly called Karen, sent me letters with vague warnings about non-compliant structures, she had a way of circling my property during her morning walks, peeking through fences, and taking photographs of things that weren't her business. Most neighbors kept their distance from her, fearful of being targeted next. I simply ignored her, knowing I had done everything by the book. The RV sat behind my locked gate for months at a time, out of sight and out of mind. I only opened it up when I planned trips, and those trips were always cleared with plenty of notice to the HOA, or so I thought. That week, I had left earlier than usual for work, planning to come back in the evening and load up the RV for a weekend getaway, but an unexpected meeting was cancelled, and I found myself back home by mid-morning. Pulling into my driveway, I noticed right away that something was off. The side gate, my gate, which I always locked, was wide open. At first, I told myself I must have forgotten. Maybe I had been in a hurry the night before. But as I stepped out of my truck and rounded the corner, the sight froze me in place. The RV wasn't parked neatly on the pad. It was halfway out of the driveway, its rear wheels still inside the fence line, but its front end angled toward the street. The door was propped open, and inside, I could hear the unmistakable sound of bags being tossed and cupboards being opened. Someone was inside my RV. My first thought was theft. Maybe it was a burglar, some opportunist who had noticed the gate ajar. But then I saw the vehicle parked just beyond the curb. It wasn't a getaway car. It wasn't even a stranger's car. It was a familiar white SUV, spotless as always, with the HOA parking decal glinting on the windshield. It was Karen's car. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. The HOA president was inside my RV, creeping closer. I peeked through the open door. Inside, Karen was moving quickly, stuffing bags of groceries and blankets into the cupboards. As though preparing for a trip, she wasn't alone. Two teenagers, her kids, were carrying armfuls of board games and snacks. One of them asked something I couldn't quite hear, and Karen responded in that sharp, commanding tone everyone in the neighborhood knew too well. She was preparing to take my RV on a trip. The audacity of it nearly made my head spin. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't her accidentally thinking it was abandoned or available. She had backed her SUV up close, loaded it with bags, and was clearly treating my RV as her personal family camper. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of rage and disbelief. For months, this woman had harassed me about rules, threatening fines for supposed violations, demanding compliance. And now she was trespassing, breaking into my locked property, and preparing to steal my RV outright. I pulled out my phone, ready to record everything, but my foot must have crunched against the gravel. Karen turned toward the door, her face paling for a split second before twisting into fury. She shouted something to her kids and stormed down the RV steps, her finger jabbing the air toward me as though I were the one trespassing. Within seconds, she had pulled out her phone. Her voice carried across the driveway as she dialed and began shouting into the receiver. She was calling 911. She was reporting me. I stood there, stunned, as I realized what she was doing. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't running. She was flipping the story, trying to turn it against me, as though I were the aggressor and she were the victim. The sound of her voice, shrill and insistent, echoed down the street. Curtains shifted in neighbors' windows. A couple walking there. Dogs slowed down to watch. Karen was staging the narrative right there, right then, and if the police arrived before I could prove what was really happening, her word as HOA president might outweigh mine. What had started as a normal Saturday morning had instantly turned into a standoff. My RV was half loaded with someone else's belongings, my gate was wide open, and the HOA president was calling the cops on me for daring to catch her in the act, and that was just the beginning. The police arrived. The neighborhood was already stirring with whispers before the wail of sirens cut through the quiet air. Karen had planted herself at the edge of my driveway, pacing like a lawyer rehearsing a closing argument, one hand still clutching her phone as she repeated her accusations. To anyone listening, she was the victim. She painted a picture of trespass, threats, and an unstable neighbor who posed a danger to the community. Every glance she cast my way was exaggerated. Every gesture, a performance meant for the gathering eyes of the subdivision. By the time the first squad car rolled into view, half the cul-de-sac had found excuses to be outside. Some carried trash bags they didn't need to set out until evening. Others leaned on rakes or watering cans, watching from their lawns as if the unfolding drama were a free Saturday matinee. And then there was my RV, the center of it all, sitting awkwardly with its nose angled toward the street, its door hanging open, and its cupboards stuffed with someone else's supplies. The cruiser stopped in front of my driveway. Two officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but their postures firm. They had seen scenes like this before, neighbors arguing, accusations flying, but there was a difference this time. The HOA president was involved, and she wasted no time capitalizing on it. She rushed forward, waving her arms, her voice rising above the hum of gossip. She pointed at me with the authority of someone used to being obeyed, her words spilling over each other as she declared I was a threat, that I had confronted her family, that I had somehow tried to keep them from leaving my property. The officers raised their hands, urging calm, but Karen was relentless. She gestured to her children, who were now standing awkwardly by her SUV, heads down, avoiding eye contact. They didn't look frightened. They looked embarrassed, as though they knew the show their mother was putting on was about to backfire. When one of the officers finally turned to me, his expression was cautious but attentive. He asked for my version of events. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded. I explained how I had returned home early, found my locked gate open, and discovered the HOA president and her children inside my RV, loading it with supplies. I motioned toward the bags of groceries, blankets, and games already inside. I described the padlock I had found dangling broken on the ground. The officer's brow furrowed, and he walked over to examine the RV. He climbed the steps, looked inside, and saw exactly what I had described. The evidence was right there. Still, Karen continued her performance. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that she had simply been inspecting the vehicle because of ongoing HOA violations. She insisted she had the authority to enter my property, to check for compliance, and that my return had startled her. Her words dripped with confidence, but the cracks were beginning to show. The officer held up the broken padlock, asking how an inspection required breaking into private property. Karen faltered for a moment, then pivoted, saying the lock was old, that it must have fallen apart on its own. She insisted she had intended no harm, that her family had merely sought shade, while waiting for her car to cool down in the heat. But the sight of grocery bags, neatly stacked in my cupboards, told a different story. The second officer asked to see proof of ownership. That part was easy. I retrieved my registration and insurance from my desk inside the house. Everything was in my name, current and valid. My RV wasn't abandoned. It wasn't in violation. It was mine, and mine alone. By now, the neighbors had drawn closer, their whispers growing bolder. People were filming on their phones, some pretending to check their mail while recording every word. The show Karen had staged was no longer under her control. She could feel it slipping, and the desperation showed in her eyes. She raised her voice, claiming I had threatened her when I caught her in the RV. She gestured wildly, saying she had feared for her safety, that I had cornered her family. The officer turned back to me, asking if I had said anything threatening. I shook my head. I hadn't spoken a word until she called the police. My phone's video recording backed that up. I had caught the moment she spotted me, the instant she turned the story upside down, calling 911 while her children stood by awkwardly. The officer watched the clip, silent but intent. It was clear Karen had been caught, and she knew it. Still, she refused to give up. She pivoted again, claiming that even if the RV belonged to me, it wasn't allowed in the neighborhood. She pointed at the HOA bylaws, saying she was merely enforcing the rules. She clung to that justification like a lifeline, as if it erased the fact she had trespassed, broken a lock, and tried to take something that wasn't hers. But the officers weren't swayed. They reminded her she had no authority to enter private property without permission. They noted the damage to my gate and padlock. They told her that HOA business didn't excuse criminal behavior. Her face flushed red, her voice rising to a shriek as she tried one last time to twist the narrative. But the words only made her sound unhinged. Finally, one of the officers turned to her with a firmness that silenced even the whispers of the crowd. He told her she was dangerously close to being charged with trespassing and attempted theft. He said the evidence was clear, and the only reason she wasn't in handcuffs already was because I hadn't pressed charges yet. The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors exchanged glances. Phones recorded every detail. Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, her children tugging nervously at her sleeve. The performance was over. The officers told her to leave the property immediately and not to return without legitimate cause. She stormed toward her SUV, her every step radiating anger. She barked at her children to get inside, slammed the door, and peeled away from the curb with a squeal of tires that echoed down the street. The neighbors slowly dispersed, though not without lingering glances and knowing smirks. Word would spread fast. The HOA president had been caught red-handed trying to steal an RV, and the whole neighborhood had seen it. I stood in my driveway, the adrenaline still buzzing in my veins. My RV was safe, for now, but something told me this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She would regroup, scheme, and find another way to strike back. And when she did, I knew the next chapter of this battle was going to be even uglier. Retaliation. Through the HOA, the days following the police incident felt deceptively calm. For a brief moment, I thought the storm had passed. The RV sat secure in my driveway, the gate repaired, a new padlock gleaming in the afternoon sun. Neighbors who once barely nodded in passing now lingered in conversation, subtle acknowledgments that they had seen the truth unfold. Whispers of sympathy reached my ears, small comments about Karen's overreach, about how far she had gone this time. For once, I wasn't the outsider. For once, the neighborhood had seen through the performance. But Karen wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. She vanished from public view for several days, and in that silence, I knew she was plotting. When she finally resurfaced, it was with the full weight of the HOA behind her. The first sign arrived in the form of a letter, neatly folded in an HOA envelope, placed in my mailbox. The words inside were cold, clinical, and deliberate. They claimed my RV violated community guidelines by being unsightly and improperly stored. They listed fines, hundreds of dollars per week, that would accumulate until the vehicle was removed. They accused me of being non-compliant, a disruptive influence on the community, and warned that further violations could result in legal action. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just days earlier, Karen had been caught trying to load her own family into that same RV, ready to drive away as if it were hers. Now, she called it an eyesore, a nuisance, a blight on the neighborhood's reputation. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also calculated. She was striking where she held power, not through theft, not through physical trespass, but through the fine print of HOA bylaws. I wasn't surprised when the letters kept coming. Each one was harsher than the last. They cited noise complaints, even though my yard was quiet. They accused me of improper landscaping, though my grass was neatly trimmed. They even claimed my fence was 2 inches taller than allowed, though it had stood the same height since long before I bought the property. Every page reeked of retaliation. It was clear Karen was weaponizing the HOA, using its rules as her arsenal, turning bureaucracy into a form of harassment. Neighbors noticed. Some avoided eye contact now, as if afraid to be seen showing sympathy. Others whispered apologies, saying their hands were tied. Karen's influence was strong, and few were willing to challenge her publicly. The memory of her humiliation still lingered, but her grip on the HOA remained firm. She was determined to restore her authority, and she had chosen me as the example. The situation escalated when a certified letter arrived, demanding that I attend a formal HOA hearing. The notice accused me of multiple violations: improper storage of a recreational vehicle, damage to common property, and conduct unbecoming of a community member. The words were absurd, twisted to fit her narrative, but the hearing was mandatory. It was clear Karen had orchestrated this, rallying the board behind her, painting me as the neighborhood problem. The day of the hearing, I walked into the clubhouse and found a row of board members seated behind a long table. Karen sat at the center, her posture stiff, her smile thin and venomous. She greeted me with the air of someone already certain of the outcome. The room was staged in her favor. Documents were stacked neatly in front of her, a binder full of supposed violations. She spoke with rehearsed precision, listing every accusation, each one delivered with the confidence of someone who believed she could bend truth into fact. But I had prepared as well. I laid out photographs of my RV, parked neatly on my property, within the boundaries allowed. I showed receipts for my landscaping, proof that my lawn care was up to date. I presented measurements of my fence, accurate to the inch, showing it was compliant. And then, for the final blow, I brought forward the evidence from just days earlier: the broken padlock, the police report, and the video recording of Karen standing in my driveway, caught in her lie. The board shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her gaze, others whispered among themselves. The air grew heavy with tension. Karen tried to dismiss the evidence, claiming it was irrelevant, a misunderstanding, an unrelated incident. But her words lacked the conviction they once carried. The truth was plain, and for the first time, the authority she wielded seemed fragile. The board didn't dismiss the case entirely. They rarely did. They issued a warning about the RV, citing minor technicalities, a way to appease Karen without directly siding with her. But the weight of her accusations had been blunted. Her attempt to crush me through the HOA had faltered. Still, the look in her eyes as I left the clubhouse told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a longer war. That night, the harassment shifted gears. Anonymous notes appeared on my porch, warning me to comply or face consequences. My trash cans were mysteriously tipped over. A neighbor reported seeing Karen pacing near my driveway late at night, muttering to herself. She was unraveling, her obsession deepening, and it was becoming clear she wouldn't stop until she forced me out. The community had become a battlefield. My property was the front line, my RV the symbol of resistance. Karen had failed to steal. It failed to erase me through the HOA, but her determination was Every move she made was an escalation, a new tactic in her crusade to reassert dominance. And as I watched her from my window, pacing beneath the glow of the streetlight, her face twisted with fury, I realized this wasn't about rules, property, or even pride. This was personal. Karen needed to win, and she wouldn't stop until one of us was broken. The question was, how far was she willing to go? The smear campaign the following week brought no peace. The hearing had ended without the crushing victory Karen expected, and that failure only deepened her obsession. I had exposed her lies in front of the very board she controlled, and although she still managed to scrape together a minor warning against me, the humiliation was something she couldn't forgive. She needed a new weapon, and this time she didn't hide behind official letters or HOA procedures. She went after my reputation. That started quietly. Neighbors who once waved suddenly turned their backs. A friend across the street, who had borrowed my tools more than once, stopped answering calls. At first, I thought it was coincidence, the natural ebb and flow of suburban relationships. But then the whispers began. In hushed conversations I overheard at the corner of the block, I became the villain of the neighborhood. Karen's story spread like wildfire, carefully spun and dramatized. She told anyone who would listen that I was dangerous, unstable, and hostile. She painted me as the aggressor, claiming I had threatened her family, that my RV was a magnet for crime, that I was dragging the neighborhood's value down. She told people I had screamed at her children, that I was a menace who watched neighbors with cameras and intimidated anyone who came too close. The lies were elaborate, rehearsed, delivered with that same tone of authority she used in HOA meetings. To those who hadn't seen the truth with their own eyes, her performance was convincing. By the time I realized what she was doing, the narrative had already taken hold. I wasn't just the guy with the RV anymore. I was the problem neighbor. It escalated. With startling speed, my mailbox overflowed with anonymous letters, some nasty, some threatening, others dripping with passive-aggressive advice about finding a community better suited for someone like me. Flyers appeared on light poles, warning of a dangerous man in the neighborhood, accompanied by blurry photos of me unloading groceries or working in my yard. The photos had clearly been taken without my knowledge. Karen's campaign wasn't limited to paper. Social media groups dedicated to the neighborhood lit up with her accusations. Screenshots of supposed complaints were posted, each one twisting events until I looked like the aggressor. People who had never even spoken to me shared her posts, repeating the lies until they took on a life of their own. The harassment seeped into daily life. Packages delivered to my door vanished before I could retrieve them. My trash cans were kicked into the street. Strange cars idled outside my house at odd hours, their occupants pretending to check their phones while snapping pictures. The community, once a place of quiet routines, had transformed into hostile territory. The worst part wasn't the petty vandalism or the notes, it was the isolation. Those neighbors who once sympathized with me after the RV theft incident now avoided contact, afraid of being dragged into Karen's drama. Karen had learned long ago that fear was contagious, and she spread it with precision. Too many siding with her meant safety. Siding with me meant risk. It didn't take long before the police were dragged back into it. Late one night, flashing lights filled my driveway again. Karen had called 911, claiming I was brandishing a weapon on my porch. Officers approached cautiously, hands on their holsters, only to find me sitting with nothing but a cup of coffee in my hand. It was harassment disguised as concern. Another attempt to paint me as dangerous. The officer's report noted unfounded claims, but I knew Karen wasn't discouraged. Each false call, each baseless accusation, planted another seed of suspicion. In the minds of those watching, it was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow erosion of reputation, designed to isolate and exhaust me. I tried to fight back the only way I knew how, by documenting everything. I kept records of the flyers, screenshots of the social media posts, photographs of the vandalism. Every false police call was added to a growing file. But evidence wasn't enough to stop the damage. In a community where perception mattered more than truth, Karen's narrative was poisoning the well faster than I could clear it. The RV became a symbol in the middle of it all. Where I saw freedom, investment, and personal property, Karen saw leverage. She used it as the centerpiece of her campaign, claiming it was proof of my disregard for rules, my selfishness, my inability to fit in. To her followers, the RV wasn't just a vehicle, it was the enemy parked in plain sight. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. I walked outside to find the RV vandalized, its sides sprayed with crude graffiti, words like "Get Out" and HOA rules scrawled in dripping black paint. The locks had been tampered with again, the tires slashed. Whoever had done it wasn't just sending a message, they were trying to destroy what they couldn't steal. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. Some looked guilty, others smug. Karen, standing across the street with arms crossed, didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. She hadn't lifted the spray can herself, but her influence was written across the vandalism as clearly as the paint. I filed a police report, but the officers shook their heads with the weariness of men who had seen this too often. Without clear evidence tying the act to Karen, they said it was just another incident. To them, it was property damage. To me, it was war. That night, as I scrubbed the paint from the RV's surface, I realized Karen's smear campaign had succeeded in one thing: it had left me alone. The neighborhood had turned cold. The HOA was her weapon, and the police could only respond after the fact. She had boxed me in, forcing me to fight battles on every front. But Karen had made one mistake. In her hunger to destroy me, she had grown reckless. Every note, every call, every piece of vandalism was more evidence. And while she thought she was grinding me down, she was only fueling my resolve. Because this wasn't just about an RV anymore. It wasn't about rules, bylaws, or even property lines. It was about standing up to a bully who had gone too far, about refusing to bow to a system twisted by her control. And if Karen wanted a war, then a war was exactly what she was going to get. Escalation. The night after the vandalism, the neighborhood felt different. The silence was heavy, unnatural, as if everyone was waiting for the next explosion. I could feel eyes on me from behind curtains when I stepped outside to lock the gates. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, throwing long shadows across the yard. Karen had turned the entire block into a stage, and everyone else into her audience. But the smear campaign and property damage weren't enough for her. She had tasted power and wanted more. If she couldn't push me out with lies and whispers, she would escalate until I either broke or left on my own. That became clear only days later, when sabotage crept into the mix. It began with small things. One morning, I found the garden hose left running full blast, flooding the flower beds. Another day, I discovered nails scattered across the end of my driveway, placed with precision to ensure my tires wouldn't survive another trip. The RV patched up after the graffiti was targeted again, this time with sugar poured into the gas tank. It was deliberate, methodical, and designed to make life impossible. I started checking locks twice, then 3 times, reinforcing doors and installing cameras across the property. Every time I thought I was one step ahead, another act of sabotage appeared: a broken fence post, trash dumped across the lawn, an anonymous letter slipped under the door with words cut from magazines like some kind of ransom note. Leave or else. The stress seeped into everything. Sleep became shallow and restless, meals tasteless, days heavy with suspicion. I scanned every passing car, every unfamiliar face. The neighbors, once background characters in daily life, now seemed like suspects in Karen's growing army. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Karen herself stayed just far enough removed to avoid direct blame. She presented herself as the concerned neighbor, the victim who was only doing what was best for the community. But her fingerprints were all over it. The same smug glance when the RV sat disabled in the driveway. The same satisfied smirk when flyers appeared overnight. She didn't have to dirty her hands. She had others to do it for her. The HOA meetings turned into a circus. Karen used them as a platform, waving printouts of supposed complaints, painting me as a hostile recluse, undermining the neighborhood's values. Her allies nodded dutifully, their minds already poisoned by her campaign. When I presented my evidence, photos, screenshots, reports, Karen countered with accusations of fabrication. She framed me as manipulative, suggesting I was staging the incidents myself for attention. The board, weary of the drama but unwilling to confront their queen bee, took the easy path. They issued more warnings, each one more absurd than the last. Failure to maintain harmonious relations, improper use of property, unapproved modifications that amounted to nothing more than my security cameras. Each fine and notice was another tightening of the noose. It all built toward a breaking point. The sabotage, the false accusations, the isolation. It was designed to push me over the edge. And one night, Karen got exactly what she wanted, a confrontation. It happened late, long after the sun had set. I was sitting on the porch, the hum of cicadas filling the air, when I heard the metallic clang of the RV's latch. I rose silently, heart pounding, and crept toward the sound. There, under the dim glow of a street lamp, stood 2 figures. One was a man in a hoodie, the other a teenager holding a flashlight. They were fiddling with the RV's door, tools in hand, completely absorbed in their work. I flicked on the porch light, flooding the yard with brightness. The intruders froze like animals caught in a snare. The teenager bolted instantly, sprinting into the shadows, but the man hesitated long enough for me to recognize him. He wasn't a stranger. He was one of Karen's regular visitors, the same man who showed up at her door during HOA meetings, always lingering on her porch, always avoiding eye contact when I passed. When he finally fled, I didn't chase him. I just stood there, staring at the RV, adrenaline surging. That was the confirmation I needed. Karen wasn't just whispering lies or bending rules anymore. She was orchestrating a campaign of sabotage, enlisting people to do her dirty work. She had turned the entire neighborhood into a battlefield, and I was the only target. I called the police, but the response was predictable. With no arrests, no direct proof tying Karen to the man, it was another incident under investigation. The report was filed, the officer's pen scratching with indifference, and then they were gone. Another paper trail, another dead end. The next morning, Karen made her move. She stood in the center of the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, gathering signatures from neighbors. It was a petition, demanding that I be removed from the community. She claimed I was a danger, that my property was a blight, that my IVA attracted criminals, and after the confrontation the night before, she had her evidence, a story twisted, until it cast me as the aggressor. Neighbors signed reluctantly, some out of fear, others out of apathy. A few even believed her. By the time I left the house that afternoon, the paper was nearly full. Karen caught my eye across the street, her smirk sharper than ever. She thought she had me cornered, that she was about to win the war she started. But what she didn't realize was that every escalation, every petty act of sabotage, every lie and smear had been documented. The file I kept was no longer just a collection of scraps, it was a weapon. And if she wanted to drag this into a final showdown, I was ready to bring the whole thing crashing down on her. The stage was set. Karen had escalated beyond rules and bylaws, beyond gossip and harassment. She had crossed into criminal territory, and I had the proof. It was only a matter of time before the scales tipped. And when they did, Karen wouldn't be the one writing the story anymore. The collapse, the petition, was supposed to be Karen's crowning achievement, the final nail in the coffin she had been hammering together for months. She strutted door to door with her clipboard, smiling at every signature, feeding on the fear she had cultivated. To her, this was already a victory parade. The neighbors, whether coerced or convinced, were bowing to her will. She imagined me packing up the RV and disappearing in disgrace, another trophy for her ego. But what she didn't know was that the walls she had built were about to crumble from the inside. Every lie, every smear, every act of sabotage had left a trail, and I had gathered enough of it to turn her game against her. The breaking point came at the next HOA board meeting. The room was full, the air thick with tension. Karen sat at the front, clipboard in hand, her petition spread like a prize across the table. She launched into her speech, spinning her web of accusations with rehearsed confidence. She painted me as hostile, unstable, a menace to the community. She recited the incidents one by one, twisting them until the story sounded airtight. To anyone who didn't know better, it was convincing. But then it was my turn. I carried in a box and placed it on the table. One by one, I laid out the evidence. Photographs of vandalism, video footage of trespassers, reports filed with the police, copies of threatening letters, and then, the clincher, clear recording from one of my cameras showing Karen's visitor, the same man from the RV break-in, standing at her porch the same night, tools in hand, laughing with her before walking to my property. The room fell into stunned silence. The board shifted uncomfortably. Karen's face froze, her smirk cracking into panic. She tried to dismiss it, claiming it was taken out of context, but the evidence was undeniable. The pieces fit too perfectly. Every smear, every sabotage, every escalation pointed back to her. Neighbors who had signed her petition avoided her eyes. Whispers filled the room, the tide turning as quickly as it had once flowed in her favor. The board, trapped under the weight of the evidence, had no choice but to act. They announced a formal investigation, suspending Karen's authority pending. The outcome, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was the unraveling of everything she had built. But Karen wasn't finished. In desperation, she lashed out, raising her voice, accusing me of plotting against her, of manipulating the entire neighborhood. She stormed out of the meeting, leaving the petition abandoned on the table. It was the first time anyone had seen her lose control, and it shattered the illusion of her power. The investigation moved quickly. With the video, the police reopened their case. The man in the footage was questioned, and under pressure, he admitted his role. He revealed Karen's involvement, her instructions, her promises to handle anyone who resisted. The truth spilled out, piece by piece, until the picture was undeniable. Karen hadn't just bent the rules, she had orchestrated a campaign of harassment, vandalism, and intimidation. The fallout was swift. Karen was stripped of her HOA position, banned from holding office again. Fines were levied, lawsuits followed, and the man she enlisted faced charges for trespassing and attempted theft. Karen herself wasn't spared. She faced legal consequences for conspiracy and harassment. The queen bee of the neighborhood had fallen, and her throne was nothing but ashes. For the first time in months, the street was quiet. The smear posters disappeared, the gossip faded, the tension lifted. Neighbors who had once avoided me now offered apologies, awkward but sincere. Some admitted they had been too afraid to resist Karen. Others confessed they had believed her lies. The fences mended slowly, but the shadow that had loomed over the block was gone. As for me, I finally found peace. The RV, repaired and gleaming, stood proudly in the driveway, no longer a target but a symbol of survival. The cameras stayed, not as paranoia, but as insurance, and the file of evidence, thick and complete, remained locked away, a reminder of how close things had come, and how easily a single person's obsession could poison an entire community. Karen eventually moved. Whispers said she couldn't stand the humiliation, the loss of her control. She left quietly, slipping away in the night without the parade she once demanded. Her house went up for sale, and a new family moved in, normal, friendly, untainted by the games of power and manipulation. The neighborhood began to heal. Looking back, it was never really about the RV, or the fines, or the petty rules. It was about control, about Karen's need to dominate, to bend people until they broke. She saw me as a threat because I didn't bend. I stood my ground, and in the end, that was what toppled her empire. From the porch, I often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset wash over the street. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but calm, peaceful, almost fragile. I knew things could always change, that somewhere, someone like Karen might rise again. But for now, the storm had passed. The house was mine, the land was mine, and no clipboard, no smear campaign, no desperate queen of the cul-de-sac could take that away. Karen had called 911. She had rallied the board. She had painted me as the villain. But when the dust settled, the truth stood taller than her lies, and in the end, her empire crumbled under the weight of her own ambition. The war was over, and I had won.